Welcome back, everybody. Get comfortable, and those of you viewing on the internet, welcome back as well. We've got another very exciting speaker for you. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Dr. David Schoenfeld. He is a developmental behavioral pediatrician, professor at the University of Southern California and Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. He's also the director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. He served as a commissioner for the National Commission on Children and Disasters and the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission. The author of over 100 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books, Dr. Schoenfeld provides consultation and training on youth bereavement and risk prevention in the face of major crises events within the United States and abroad. As David and I have been getting to know one another over the last couple of days, we discovered we have a rather extraordinary thing in common, and that is our favorite stress buster is hugging koala bears. I'll repeat that. Our favorite stress buster is hugging koala bears. David, welcome. There we go.
Well, good morning. So what I wanted to talk about today is really how do we support students and adult staff in schools in the aftermath of crisis events. And what I'm planning on doing is I'm going to introduce you to the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement and talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done. I'll then turn to some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see in children and adults after a crisis, talk about the timeline or the process of adjustment from these events, and then I want to turn to staff support and professional self-care, and then just introduce the Coalition to Support Grieving Students as a free resource that you may find useful in your work. The center was actually created back in 2005. I had been doing this work and had a program at Yale starting in about 1990, 1991 that was continuously funded since then, and then was asked to coordinate the training for the school crisis teams for New York City schools after 9/11, which I did for several years. And then this consortium of foundations that got some dedicated funding for 9/11 recovery approached us to try and continue to fund this work by establishing the center. Our current funding is from the New York Life Foundation. And we really just want to promote an appreciation of the role that schools and school staffs can take to serve, to support students, staff, and family members at times of both crisis and loss. So we do work in bereavement and we do work in trauma, and we try and combine those two areas. We also want to enhance training and professional education programs. That was one of the main reasons for the center. I was doing 55 full-day workshops for New York City schools that I fit into my regular day job at Yale. Yale is not actually in New York City, so it really wasn't that convenient. And somebody came up to me at the end and said, of one of the workshops, and said, you know, all the teachers should go through this training. And I asked, how many are there? And they looked at me and they said, somewhere around 120 to 130,000. So I looked at him and I said, well, why don't we just rent Madison Square Garden and I will do it there. And the person looked at me and said, I don't know if we can get the garden. I was like, that was a joke. And I looked at them and just said, why does an educator get out of a school of education if they're not prepared to support a kid who's in distress? Do they think that the kids always come to school happy? They should have, these are basic skills. So we decided that that was the reason for creating the center, was to prepare educators at the pre-service level. Only problem is, of course, schools of education are not seeking my advice on what to include in their curriculum, so it was not an easy goal to take on. I will share with you some of the coalition work. We're making some progress on it. We've actually started pilot testing a curriculum in schools of education. We're starting to make some inroads, but it is quite a bit after that. We also serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance that we provide at no charge to schools when they are in crisis events. And I will come back to our website, which I've listed here, which is schoolcrisiscenter.org. Through an interdisciplinary team of medical, mental health, and school professionals who are members of the Professional Advisory Board of the Center, we provide confidential on-site as well as remote technical assistance. We've responded remotely, for example, to Afghanistan when there was a major school shooting there and terrorist attack. And we provide consultation for school leadership and professionals. We also provide practical and hopefully timely advice, usually try and do it within an hour or two, but if I'm at a conference, sometimes it's a couple hours later, through a 24/7 toll-free phone number and email, and I'll share that information with you. We also provide ongoing support. We don't just respond to the immediate aftermath of events. We stay with the school system for as long as they wish. Sometimes that is a number of years or even a decade or more. I'm actually now working with New York City schools to implement training for all of their school staff on how to support grieving kids. So we started back on 9/11. We also provide educational resources and crisis management tools on our website. And we do school staff training and community presentations, as well as professional development for a fairly wide range of professional audiences. It could be school counselors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, pediatricians, and of course, a lot of other different disciplines too. I'm just going to go quickly through some of the more recent events that we've been involved in. I already mentioned that we provided support and training after the World Trade Center attacks in New York City. We're continuing to work with Parkland, Florida. Really, it's Broward County Schools in Florida. We also responded to the school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. I was there to help coordinate the response for the first week. We've been working with Las Vegas, Nevada, after the community shooting there. I actually go next week for a couple presentations the week before the one-year anniversary. But we've worked with the public schools, the parochial schools, and some private schools in the area, as well as the pediatric community. Responded to the school shooting in Benton, Kentucky, Spokane, Washington, Marysville, Washington, Corning, California, Aurora, Colorado, Platte Canyon, Colorado, Chardon, Ohio, Townville, South Carolina. We don't just do school shootings, but we don't actually do any school shootings. We don't respond to school shootings. I was once at a conference and someone introduced me and they said, whenever there's a crisis or disaster, David's there. And I was like, afterwards? Like it starts to look suspicious otherwise, but no, we do respond to natural disasters as well. Hurricane Maria in San Juan, Sandy in New York and New Jersey, Katrina in New Orleans, and Ike in Galveston. We've responded to the tornadoes in Joplin, Missouri, as well as in Alabama. We've responded to the wildfires in Sonoma County, as well as Sevier County, Tennessee. That was the Smoky Mountain fires. So we've been around the country, and this is really only a sample of some of the ones we've responded to. Most people have never heard of the center because we really do our work behind the scenes, feel it's better for the community to respond itself. So we empower them by trying to provide the technical assistance and the consultation. I've been doing it for over 30 years. The problem is if no one knows you do it, then they don't know how to contact you efficiently. So we're working on that aspect, but we really don't want to talk about communities while they're in crisis. We really want to just help them. We do work internationally as well. The Akita Elementary stabbing in Osaka, Japan, that happened also in 2001. There were 8 7- and 8-year-olds stabbed to death and about 15 other people who were also stabbed in that event. So their team came and watched our trainings in New York City and then also brought me back for when they opened the center to do their first, to start some of their training, and I had the opportunity to visit the school and the parents. We also went on multiple trips after the earthquake in Sichuan, China in 2008. Most of my international work is actually through academic presentations and courses, and these are just some of the countries that I've gone to after they've had crisis events. So I'm going to try and summarize some of the recommendations from that experience. People ask me, what do we actually do when we consult? And it gets hard to explain because we don't implement a particular program. We more work with the school system or the school to ask them what they need and to advise them on areas they may not be considering and help guide them through the process. But that includes both short-term needs, and that would include anything as, I remember when I was in Newtown on the weekend right after the shooting, they asked, can
can you prepare a script for teachers throughout the state of Connecticut to welcome children back on the first day of school on Monday morning? So we do prepare those type of scripts so that there's at least a guidance on what teachers might say and how they might say it. But we work long term. I worked with one school that had a mass shooting, and within a couple years they had complete turnover of all of the administrative and leadership staff in that school. And so I was at a meeting with the leadership of the school and educators and staff in that school. And I remember one of the teachers looked at the assistant principal and said, "There's absolutely nothing you can do that will ever make me feel safe in this school." And he just started crying, and he's like, "That's what I came here to help with." And she said, "Well, you will not be able to do it." And then one of the other teachers looked at the principal and the assistant principal and the head of guidance and said, "And we will never trust you because you didn't go through this event with us. You will never be part of us." And so I talked about what are we going to do about that? Because they came here to help. You're not allowing them to. And so sometimes we really help the communities heal over a period of time. Some schools we've worked with for more than a decade. We advise on models of crisis mental health services, staffing, training, and policies. I remember one school that had had a shooting, it was maybe 5 years later. The new principal in that school called me up and said, the superintendent agreed to have a family have their wake for their child who died in a car accident in our auditorium. And they're going to have the funeral here because they didn't have space anywhere else. And he said, I called the former principal and he said, call David. David's not going to be okay with this. So then I talked with him about what to do because it was happening. The family had already been offered that. I said, but you really need a policy in place against this. Otherwise, it will keep happening. And 2 weeks later, there was another child who died in a car accident, and they also had the funeral there. And they said, yeah, we have to have a policy about this. So we advise on policies even outside of individual crisis events, but we've been through enough of these that we know what some of the pitfalls might be. We offer staff support. I remember going to, often we're doing a lot of this with the administration and the leadership. I went to one community that had a large natural disaster, and I was talking with the superintendent, and I made some comment, and she said, could you repeat that? And I said, I don't actually remember what I said. And so she kind of told me, and what I had said was, you need to realize that no matter what you do, you're not going to make this okay. People are going to be angry. They're going to be upset. Kids died. Staff died. You're not going to make that all right. And she just asked me to repeat it 4 times. And she kept saying, I have to keep telling myself, no matter what I do, this isn't going to be okay. But that's what administrators think they can do, is fix things. And so this is something they're not going to be able to fix. We also talk around sometimes with human resources and HR issues. I was in one school where the principal was actually in the room where the shooting had happened. I think she came in after the shooting had happened. But she was holding the hand of one of the children that was bleeding heavily and said, don't worry, we'll get you help in time. The kid died before the paramedics arrived. And she was deeply affected by this event, as you would expect. So then the administration thought, well, she wasn't really an effective administrator, so they needed to remove her or relocate her. So they relocated her to another school without her consent or knowledge. And so there are these issues, and then they had other administrators that also were having problems. And I found out, so I met with those administrators and said, we're meeting with our supervisor tomorrow. I think we're going to be laid off. And I'm like, no, I doubt that's the case. And then I meet with the superintendent. I'm going, I'm not going to ask what the plan is tomorrow. But I hear this. You really would not remove administrators that have an emotional disability that was acquired on the job. I also don't think that would be very supportive. So I'm imagining that's not what's going to happen. And they kind of looked at me and said, could you meet with the head of HR and we have to rethink what we're doing? And I don't think that was their plan, but I've seen a number of schools where they kind of convey to staff that they're not quite doing well and maybe they'd like to think of something else. And I look at them and I go, when you've been through an event like this, it's hard to pick a toaster oven on the internet to buy. You can't pick a new career. You can't relocate. You can't find another job. It takes everything you can to get to work that day. You're not going to be able to look for another job. The people who you think are struggling the most will be the ones that remain. And if you set up a system where you're not supportive of your staff, The ones who are really great will leave and find a job someplace else. So a lot of it is talking about transparency, communication, how to deal with trauma and crisis and loss. So the issues become rather complex, as you can imagine. We also need to prepare them to address the educational impact and the academic supports. We find that students may actually lose 2 to 3 years in their academic abilities temporarily in response to these events, and the educators have a great deal of trouble teaching as well and preparing their lesson plan. And I went into one school that had a large mass shooting, and I was talking to some of the educators. It was a very high-achieving school. And they were like, what do we do? These kids are all over the place. I said, you have to now go into differentiated education. It's a challenge on a day-to-day basis, but it's now magnified. And I said, there are some kids here who were not as impacted. Maybe they didn't witness the shooting, maybe they were out that day, or maybe they were resilient. And they are trying to get into an elite college. And the other kids are trying just to sit in class without running out the door. And so they're in very different places. And I said, you know, maybe what we should do is take some of the volunteers from the college and come up with enrichment classes for the other kids that are really ready to do more challenging work, because the bottom line is just to ask you to come in and stand in front of the class and teach a lesson is a big deal. You don't have the ability to teach multiple different curricula or develop new curricula. We also do work on suicide postvention. That's a whole other topic and it's very complicated. And we do issues around commemoration and memorialization. And sometimes that's very tricky. I remember one school where the shooter was actually a popular child. And he ended up killing himself and killing a lot of his friends and colleagues. And when it came time, I think it was about 6 months after the shooting had happened, they wanted to do something to remember the students that had died. Well, his friends, his cousins, you know, the other kids who were still connected emotionally to the shooter asked to have his picture included, and the school refused and said, we can't do that because he killed and murdered these people. So what they did was their own way to honor him. And unfortunately, their choice was not very good. And so they ended up, the student had some unrelated chronic illness for which they had done a fundraiser, like a walk or something. And so they had T-shirts that said team and then the kid's name. So all of his friends wore it that day, along with black armbands, which was obviously a really bad choice at so many levels. And that was to show their solidarity for their grief over their friend and relative who had died. This got picked up by the newspaper locally. It started with their friends of the shooter. And it was kind of like they were supporting the shooting. So it was a bad decision on their part, but it was also not a great decision on the school's part. And I was talking to one of the staff and he said, look, the problem is I cared about this kid too, and I thought he was a good kid. Do you know what that feels like as an educator, that you can make that level of misjudgment? I'd question whether I should even be a teacher at this point. And you're asking me to help these kids grieve the loss of a kid I grieve too, when I am so torn over what he did? Do you know how hard that is? And I looked at him and I said, yes, I do, but I know it's harder for a kid. And so I kind of said, we have to do something, because you can't tell people they can't grieve. They're going to do it. You just have to guide them into ways that are more helpful. So commemoration and memorialization is a whole nother topic, and we spend a lot of time working with schools and communities on this. You can find more information on our website at schoolcrisiscenter.org. There's one section that says, I need help now, and you can get all these guidance documents. What do you do if there's a suicide? You know, step-by-step guides that we've developed. And then there's Help Me Prepare, and it goes into other materials for preparedness. And then we have topical items. So the one that's on the top on that banner, it's on how do you talk to kids about terrorist attacks or school shootings in the news. So a lot of our work is really on preparing educators and other school staff to be able to support kids at times of crisis and loss. We focus on creating a supportive and empathic presence for all of the adults in the school. And I think this teacher describes it quite well. She's one of the teachers that I interviewed in developing the educational materials. So I'll let her illustrate that.
2 years ago, I had a student come back from a funeral, and the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital and that's why he hasn't been at school. I said, oh, okay. So then when he came back, I said, Jonathan, he said, my mom passed. I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, Jonathan. And I hugged him, and then I looked at him, and I was gonna lose it because of my heart, your mother, you know. And he looked at me and he goes, Jackie, please don't. And I said, okay. So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. And we're all here for you. And my door is always open. And, you know, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, thank you. And I you know, one look up from my desk, what are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know, thank you. And I said, you know, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here, and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, you know, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I'll take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
And that's a lot of what you do, is you're just listening to the music with the kids after these events. You're just being an empathic presence with them. And the problem is we don't teach the dance steps to teachers. We don't do it to doctors. We don't really do it to very many professional groups, if any. I haven't met a group yet where it's consistently taught. And that's what we're trying to teach. We're not asking classroom educators to triage, to screen, to treat, or to intervene. We're asking them to be present, to be supportive, and to be helpful, to make the accommodations and supports that will help kids thrive in the aftermath of these events. So let me go over some of the potential symptoms of adjustment reactions that we ask them to look for or to at least think about. And I want to say that the most common symptom is not actually on the slide. That's nothing. Most kids don't show their distress in any visible way. So you shouldn't wait for these. If kids have been through very difficult experiences or had traumatic exposures, you need to start providing support to them. But we will see sleep problems, trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, frequent wakening, difficulty wakening, nightmares. Any disruption in sleep also disrupts their work performance, whether that's the adult who's trying to teach or it's the child that's trying to learn. And I should have prefaced this by saying, I'm going to use examples from major traumatic events that have occurred in the country, but this applies if it's a family crisis or an individual crisis. So you don't have to wait for tsunami to use any of these strategies. Kids come in crisis because of something that's happened at home every day into classrooms. And so you can use them every day. We also will see separation anxiety and school avoidance. A lot of times kids will be hesitant to separate from those that they care about for fear that something will happen to them or those that they care about. So a child may feel they need to be home to make sure that their parent's okay when there's been a crisis event that's happened. And so I do a lot of work with pediatricians, and I tell them, please do not write those medical excuse letters for the kids to stay home. Let's get the kids back into a school setting with the supports, with the accommodations to make it tolerable, but the expectation has to be for recovery, and we have to start them on that process. You'll also see anxiety and trauma-related fears. I think people are familiar with the trauma-specific fears, but they may also have fears that just come from anxiety. So there might have been a shooting that happened during the day, but they're now afraid of the dark. And so they just become more fearful. And sometimes people don't anticipate that and don't expect that to happen. Kids and adults will have difficulties with concentration that leads to deterioration in academic performance, as I've already mentioned, and a lot of what we do is try and provide the academic supports that will work for these kids. And sometimes that requires some experimentation. You also see regression. I think most people are familiar with developmental regression. You have a 5-year-old who does fine at kindergarten and now all of a sudden after a crisis becomes more clingy. But you can also get social regression, and people don't anticipate that. They become more self-centered, more inflexible, they're just irritable, they're cranky, And this happens in the adults as well. I went to one school, it was after a large natural disaster, and I was talking to the parents after school, and I asked the parents how old the kids were before we got started. And one mother said, well, I have a number of kids, but I'm most worried about two. One is 5 and one is 35 years old. And I'm more worried about the 35-year-old. Her husband was standing next to her. He picked up one of the toddlers and left the room crying. And I don't think he returned. He was really struggling. And so the issue is, it is not just the children, and it is not just the parents. It's the teachers, it's the administration, it's the mental health providers. It's everyone in the system. That is a risk that you'll see for a lot of people. You can see sadness and depression, as you would expect, but you may also see substance abuse, increase in alcohol, tobacco, other drug use. Remember when I was in China, I was talking with the staff in one of the schools. It was a middle school, and the building had collapsed during school, and I think about 40% of the children and staff were killed, and the other 60% were buried alive and dug out of the rubble. So highly traumatic event. I'm standing in a tent in a resettlement community, and I asked the teacher, how are the kids doing? And he said, well, they're middle school students, they've been smoking more. And I looked at him, I said, how are you doing? And his principal was standing next to him. He didn't even hesitate. He looked at me and he goes, I drink every night to fall asleep. So that's what you'll see, and I've seen this among healthcare providers as well, is an increase in substance use. So if you have a crisis recovery plan in your school and it does not include substance abuse counseling services, you need to rethink that, or at least have an MOU or some other arrangement set up. You can also see somatization. A lot of kids will present with physical complaints, adults do this as well, when they're really psychologically distressed. So we do a lot of work with school nurses because they get inundated with this. The challenge is they also get inundated with more physical health problems. So stress hormones will increase, risk with diabetes, more asthma attacks, hypertension. I went to one school where I met with the principal right when he was returning a couple weeks after the shooting, and he had been out because he had cardiac bypass surgery after his heart attack, which happened right afterwards. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not the only one with stress-related health problems in this school. Do you ever see an increase in this after a shooting? And I looked at him and I said, are you asking me if stress-related health problems increase after stressful events? And he said, yes, do they? And I go, yes, they do. So I know we can just state that, but the issue is this principal is now helping his school recover from a shooting, and he's recovering from a heart attack at the same time. So you can just imagine the impact of these events. Then what you do is you see another common symptom is guilt. A lot of individuals who have been through difficult situations will often feel responsible for them. It seems that when something bad happens, people feel badly, and when they feel badly, they assume they have done something bad. It appears at some level, at least unconsciously, that individuals would prefer to be guilty than to recognize they had no role in it. And the reason for that is, if someone you care about has died or been shot, and you can say, I made a mistake, then you get the illusion of control, and you commit to never making that mistake again, and you then believe it won't happen again. The problem with that is it's only an illusion of control. It actually doesn't prevent further tragedies when you weren't responsible. And furthermore, that guilt is very difficult to live with, and it doesn't promote coping and adjustment. So we go in and talk about guilt, and I've done bereavement work for over 30 years. I've only found 2 or 3 situations where I didn't find the guilt. It is so universal. And often it is not shared with people because to tell someone you know that you are responsible for a crisis or for a death is very difficult. So they don't talk about it. But if you go in and you say this is a common phenomenon, people will come forward. I remember I went to one school, a student had died. She was a very popular student. She was actually the team mascot in the school. And she went to it was a basketball game. She was dressed up as the mascot, went and stayed at a girlfriend's home. And she wasn't drinking, she wasn't using drugs, she wasn't ill, she'd just been at the basketball game. They went to sleep, and the other girl woke up and found her dead in bed. Autopsy was negative. They never found a cause of death. So there's a death of unknown cause that happens in a healthy kid who's sharing a bed with a friend. who didn't even notice it until she woke up the next morning. That friend did not want to go back into that bed or apartment, which was, unfortunately, her home. So she would not return home. She had already been diagnosed with depression, and she had already been suicidal in the past. So the school would not allow her to return to school until she had been cleared, but she couldn't find a psychiatrist that would clear her, and she couldn't go home until that was done. So anyway, so we worked with her, we worked with the school, and in this particular case, some of the kids signed up to meet with me. And I remember one girl met with me, and she looked at me and she goes, "Do you think you can actually tell the future?" And you learn in counseling, the correct answer is not yes or no, it's why do you ask? So she looks at me and she goes, "This may sound odd, but we're juniors now, and when I go and look at my friends, I can see what college they're going to." I feel like saying, "You should become a college counselor, that's incredible." But anyway, and I said, "So why do you mention that to me?" And she looked at me and she said, "Because I looked at the girl that died 2 weeks before she died, and I didn't see a college, and I knew then she was gonna die, and I failed to tell anyone. And it's my fault she's dead." So then we talked about this phenomenon occurs, and that doesn't mean you're actually responsible. And maybe she just would have gotten a job for a year. Like you didn't know she was actually going to die, did you? So anyway, sometimes you can't deal with the guilt very quickly, but you need to work with people to at least forgive themselves. We also see post-traumatic reactions and disorders. Before I go into that, for the guilt, this is Calvin. He calls for his mother and he says, "A big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs." He says, "I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend." And his mother says, "Well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen." And he points out there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So we really work a lot on this guilt because I think that that's a very common reaction. And I was not going to go over the post-traumatic reactions and disorders because I think we've done a good job as a field in trying to get information out about being trauma-informed and post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic symptoms. But I'm going to now say that that's great, we've done that, but I think we've done it in a somewhat unidimensional way. And people seem to think that anything that happens after a traumatic event is a post-traumatic reaction, and that is not always the case. There actually are a wide range of reactions and concerns after these events that go beyond PTSD. Sometimes it's bereavement. I responded to one shooting that happened in a community, and there was a young man who was at the community event, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was not injured. And he came back to school once in the intervening 3 weeks, stayed for about an hour, and otherwise was not really communicating with people at school. He was not taking phone calls, and he was declining all counseling. So I went to his home with his permission and asked him why he wasn't going for counseling. And he looked at me and he goes, they keep wanting to talk about the shooting. And he said, "You know, look, it was dark. I didn't even know what was happening. And then it was over. And I didn't realize until it was done. And I had some trauma symptoms. I couldn't sleep for a couple nights. I was jittery. I startled." He goes, "But that's all resolved. I don't need any help with that." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, why don't you leave your home?" And he goes, "I leave my home every day. I meet with my friends that were there. They understand what I've been through. We're going camping this weekend. I'm tired of everyone thinking I'm scared. I'm not afraid." So I said, "Well, why aren't you back in school?" And he said, "Well, I did go back, but it didn't feel right to be there without her." He was on a date with the young woman he planned on marrying, and she was dead. And being in school without her didn't feel right. So I looked at him and I said, "Well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend." And he looked at me surprised and said, "That's it. And if someone's willing to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling today. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooting." Now, he had been through a very traumatic event. And I understand why people would think about post-traumatic disorders and post-traumatic reactions. But for him, loss was really the most salient point. And what we find is that this is common in these events. I've been in situations where people have refused to even notify families about bereavement centers or bereavement camps because they say the kids have to be treated for trauma first. But some kids need to get support around the loss first. And that's really what they're looking for. I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, as was mentioned, and one of the parents came and testified, and she said that when her child who attended Sandy Hook returned with the yearbook at the end of the school year, she said there was no picture of my child who had died who attended that school. They had removed the pictures of every child and staff member who had died. It's as if they never existed. What were they thinking? So the issue is what you do around trauma is not the same thing that you do for bereavement. Unfortunately, it's not just trauma and bereavement. There's a whole range of things. Whenever there's one of these events, there tends to be this cascade of secondary losses and stressors. So if you just think about a natural disaster like a flood, these children have forced relocation. They often have to leave their schools. They lose their peer network. They then have academic failure in trying to integrate into a new school when they've been traumatized, and when they're in a new school which has a different curriculum. They have trouble integrating into the new social network. But the trouble doesn't end with the kids. It continues with their parents. So there's often financial stresses. Relocation is costly. It's often associated with loss of employment or underemployment. That causes financial stresses for the parents, which then increases their parental stress, and then often exacerbates or often even leads to mental health problems in the adults. And that leads to marital conflict or domestic violence. So if a kid comes into class and he hasn't slept because his parents were arguing last night over how they were going to pay the rent, or the fact that they can't really afford where they're currently temporarily living because mom lost her job because the business had to close because there isn't as much tourism because of the flood, and the kid's scared they're going to get divorced and then he's not going to see his mom or dad anymore. And then you go and ask, what were you doing on the day of the flood? And you just try and go back and talk about an event, you're really missing the point. It's not just what happened, it's everything that follows. And that's what kids need help with, and the staff. And sometimes you really don't know what it is that's upsetting them until you ask them about it. But we shouldn't assume that it is just from a single event. Now, what's even more complicated is that it's not just everything that follows, often it's what preceded it. And so you may uncover that in a crisis event. I had done some training for some schools in Las Vegas prior to the shooting that happened at the concert. And one of the schools called me the day after the shooting and they said, okay, you told us about this, so we were already prepared. We had a student in the office today. She is sobbing because her mother has cancer and she's afraid she's going to die. She wasn't at the concert. Her mother wasn't at the concert. Nobody in the school knows anyone that died. But just the discussion of this in the news has raised people's sensitivity about loss. What else should we be looking for? So this is what I find is schools are becoming more sophisticated, but there's always the next level. It just gets more and more complicated. I went into one school where there had been a shooting and a child who was killed, and one of the teachers met with me and she said, you know what I thought about when this happened? When I was a kid, my father was really abusive, and one day he got drunk and he brought us out onto the porch, all the kids, put a gun to our head and said, I can shoot and kill you at any point. She goes, that's what I thought about when the shooting happened. And you can just imagine you're sending her back into her class to support children, and that's what she's dealing with at that moment. And so we find that for a lot of these situations, it's not just what happens, it's not just what follows, it's what preceded. And as a result, it's a lot of stuff. So it starts to feel a little overwhelming. And so you would think everyone will be upset or you'll see it. But actually, adults tend to underestimate the distress in children as well as adults because they don't disclose it. This is one of the posters Project Liberty put up in New York City about 6 months after 9/11. They all had the same tagline, if only the signs were this easy to read. They're not. Children will often withhold their complaints because they think it makes them abnormal, or because they don't want to burden their parents or their educators who appear to be visibly distressed themselves. So they may just try and deal with it themselves. So let me then talk about what is the timeline for recovery. If I haven't depressed you completely, what are some of the things that you may see in the process? When I go to communities, one of the first questions I'm asked is, when will we go back to the way we were? I look at them and go, that's easy, never. These are life-changing events. You're going to have to integrate it into who you are as an individual and as a community. You're not going to forget it, and you can't go back to having it not have happened. So then I talk about, well, what are the stages? So if you think about it, this is just a graph of coping over time, and our baseline adjustment is not a straight line. We have good days and we have bad days. And if we find out someone we care about is sick, or we get diagnosed with an illness, or we're in an accident, we will be in distress. But just because, so people see the distress, particularly when it's marked distress, and they say the person is in crisis. Well, a crisis event is not defined by the event itself. It's defined by the individual's or the group or system's capacity to recover from that event in the absence of external support. Resilient individuals and resilient systems experience distress all the time. They may experience the same amount of distress as someone who is in crisis. It's just that they can deal with it. So I think for the one thing that I would highlight here is that the level of distress for people who are resilient can be extreme, and they deserve and should receive our support, even if they might recover in the absence of it. So I don't know how many of you saw the Walk for Our Lives that talks for the students on gun violence, happened in Washington. If you remember, one of the students was talking about her friend who was murdered, that she watched her friend get murdered, and also ended up, I think, under kids who had been killed and was trying to hide. It's a very traumatic event. And she became overwhelmed as she started her presentation, to the point where she paused and was gagging, and then she threw up. And she stopped at that point. One of her friends took her hand. The crowd cheered her on. I was in the crowd. It was very moving. So we were really trying to support her the best we could. And after a pause, she just announced, I just threw up on international television, and it's great. And she went and she gave her presentation, and she ended by singing happy birthday to her friend who died, because it was his birthday that day. Now, that is resiliency. But it is also distress. So what I keep hearing is, why are these kids so resilient? Well, good, they're resilient, but they're suffering. And so if you have someone that's a spouse, yourself, your CEO, whatever, and they're resilient, we still should reach out to them and offer support. So I think that's an important point, particularly for this group. But there may be a crisis event that exceeds the resiliency or the capacity of the individual to respond and recover without support. So at this point, people come together, they provide assistance and support. Some people refer to this as the honeymoon period. I don't like doing that because it suggests that marriage is a disaster, which rings true for some people. And so languaging is a tricky thing in this work, but this is where people come together, they show support, they bring food, they put rubberized bracelets on, they put ribbons on their body and on vertical items, they bake food in casserole format. You know, there's certain traditions we use to say we care, even though I've never liked a single casserole. Anyway, what I do, and people start to do better. And when I'm in those communities, I tell them, what is it that is, how are you building community in a way that feels good? If the PTA is bringing food into the teacher's lounge and the teachers are talking in a way they didn't talk before and they're sharing, then decide to institutionalize that. Have a potluck once a month. Because if you don't, it goes away. The good stuff goes away. And people revert back to being the way they were, which is not always the best of what they could be. So people will start to get better in those situations. And this is where people say, oh, look, kids are resilient. They're better. Let's just go back to math class or whatever. And I look at them and I go, well, they're better, but they're not all better. And this is actually the most vulnerable time period. In New Orleans, about 4 months after Katrina, I was talking to healthcare professionals, and they could list healthcare professionals they knew who had killed themselves. There was a supplement to Pediatrics, the professional journal, dedicated to a young pediatrician in New Orleans who killed himself after the hurricane. So the issue is when people start to get better is when they have a little more energy and capacity to act on some of their depression. And they look around and they say, well, everyone looks like they're okay. And I don't feel anywhere near that. And I don't think I will be able to get to that point. And that's where the despair and hopelessness sits in. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that that's common in children. More likely, if you withdraw the support too soon, they may actually just establish a new baseline, which is just called, which I just said is continued impairment. And they may not get back to their baseline of coping. So we have to support kids and adults till they at least return to their baseline. And if we provide enough support and they have sufficient internal capacity, they may actually exceed their baseline, and that's post-traumatic growth. So they are changed, but not necessarily damaged. They're different, though. They may be more empathic. They may be more concerned about higher priorities in life. They may be more spiritual. And so I'm going to end with one story. This was actually, I was talking to a group after a natural disaster of foster parents. And one of the foster parents said to me, I think I went through this. And he told me the story. He was a young guy, happily married with a young child, and the child developed an infection and died. And he said, you know, at that point, I questioned a lot of things in my life. He said, I was in finance, I was making a lot of money, I was very successful. But all of a sudden, I questioned if that was really what I wanted to do with my life. Was it really meaningful? So he said, so I quit my job, even though I was making a lot of money. I went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher. And he said, to shape the life of a young child, that's a career. I can do that for the rest of my life. And then he became a foster parent, and he was adopting a kid. And so I do think that is post-traumatic growth. But what I want to end with is just the importance of professional care. Because people who do work in resiliency and recovery often are there because they've been through something in their past. And that is likely to be unsurfaced when you try and help others. The things that put us in positions to help others is because we know the value of that help, either because we received it or we failed to receive it. And so we need to really take care of ourselves. So the only thing that I was going to do was share with you the Coalition to Support Grieving Students material. I just want to say, and the National Resilience Institute is one of the supporting organizational members. We have over 70 organizational members. And you can go to just grievingstudents.org and find over 20 video-based modules that go over how to support grieving kids, as well as free print material that you can download. And the last slide just has our contact information. So I think they will have access to the handouts. So if you want to contact us, you can either call us, email, join one of our social media platforms. So tweet us, like us, link to us, do all those things. And that way we'll send you new materials as they become available. But thank you.
Thanks so much, David. Brilliant and heartfelt, as always. So let me introduce our next speaker so we stay right on time. This is Paula Stevens, and she's the author and founder of Crazy Good Grief, an organization that teaches positive growth and resilience after the loss of a loved one. A Gold Star mom, her oldest of 4 sons passed away unexpectedly while at home on leave from the Army. Paul is a Buddhist chaplain at her local county jail in Colorado and teaches a weekly yoga class to female inmates. She also works in hospice. All of her work is grounded in the desire to take compassionate action, to increase resilience, and empower people to positively integrate all the experiences of their lives. Let's welcome Paula.
Is my mic on? Can you guys hear me through the mic? Are we good? Okay, awesome. Good morning, and thank you so much to David. Where did David go sit down at? Oh, there he is. Thank you for queuing it up so that I could talk about self-care. I really appreciate that. So one of the things that I want to open up by touching on is so what David's work is dealing with those children. We have to remember that in all of these cases, there are parents, siblings, other people who are in those communities as well. And how I came to this work was in the acknowledgement that we have a tremendous amount of resources in the way of mental health, and we do an amazing job of supporting them to the best that we can in those areas. But my background is actually exercise physiology and exercise science. And so I had a very deep well of knowledge around how the body is resilient and how the body behaves. And for me and my grief process, because it's all very much a lived experience for me, that there has to be a way to connect the mind and the body in more than just talking about it or saying it's a mind-body connection. And so very much what my work with dealing with grieving parents, and I've actually worked really closely with some of the survivors of the Aurora Theater shooting, the parents specifically, and worked with them in developing a wellness and a self-care program that supports their grieving process. And in that case in particular, one of the things that with the mom, one of the moms that I worked with was, you know, she had to have the stamina physically to go through the trial. So in the case of the Aurora Theater shooting, the individual wasn't killed, nor did he kill himself. And so it was 2 to 3 years out that she had to have this sense of well-being in order to physically sustain herself in sitting in and out of a courtroom. And, oh, are we good? Yeah. Okay. And so from that, a lot of my work was born. And so in relationship to talking to you guys, the first sort of responders, the first line of defense, one of the things I want to talk to specifically, and David mentioned it, is the vicarious trauma that we receive as a result of our work. So yes, David's exactly right, and I'm a living example of coming to this work because of our own human experience, correct? And so I'm curious, by a show of hands, how many of you have come to this work by a lived experience? Yeah, so a lot of us, right? That's more than half of us in the room can say, we chose this step in our life and in our career to be of service to others, right? Because of our own lived experience. And so, is it hard to hear me in the back?
Yeah, if you stand in front of the podium.
So this is not?
That's just for our purposes.
Oh, right. So you actually want me to stand still. Here I was thinking I could meander everywhere. Yes, right. I'll just be here if you need me. Right, so the lived experience. So one of the things that I want to start with, so as we get these slides queued up, we'll get on track here, but let's talk about the vicarious experience of living it through someone else or sitting with someone. And I talked about this yesterday, and so I want to bring it up today as we're patiently waiting for this. So as a Buddhist, we have, in my lineage of Buddhism, we have 3 tenets that we work with, and we work with these very strongly. And this is what informs a lot of how we show up to any situation. And I think it's very important in the way of caring for ourselves that maybe we have these 3 tenets for all of us. And in Buddhism, we would say that there is a Buddha in all of us. And you know, Buddha isn't in conflict with anything, but it resonates from a place of seeing the humanity in all of us. And so maybe when you begin to do your work and you know that you're going to be in a position of maybe experiencing someone else's trauma or helping them in their process of experience, maybe we come back to the 3 tenets, okay? And so the 3 tenets that we practice from in my practice is 1, coming in with a not knowing mindset. And not knowing is not the same as I don't know. Right, we all have an area of expertise. We are all incredibly brilliant in the work that we do. And so we're not showing up saying, I don't know how to help you. I don't know what to do for you. We're showing up and saying, I'm not going to make assumptions about how to help you. I'm going to let you lead me into the best way. So not knowing mindset is coming back to the beginner's mind. Coming back to the beginner's mind of saying, gosh, I'm not sure what will be of service. I have a lot of skills to offer, but before I decide what you need, I'm going to come to you and let you share with me what it is that you need, right? So not knowing. And that helps us step into a situation and not bring our assumptions of what another person or a victim or someone in that case might need. We can just simply show up not knowing, but having faith that what we do know is going to be of value. So not knowing mindset. And the second step, or the second tenet that we have as Buddhists, is what we call bearing witness. And bearing witness comes from a deep well of empathy. Thank you. Comes from a deep well of empathy. And so when I am bearing witness, I am really being with that person, right? I'm imagining what it's like to be them. I'm bearing witness from their experience in the present, without in the back of my mind thinking, oh, I know what that's like. Oh, I've been there. Oh, gosh, let me interject something. I am simply there to hold the space for this person to tell me what they need to share in that moment. I am bearing witness. One of the things in my Buddhist community that they do is what we call a street retreat. And I love the concept of a street retreat, and I'm going to tell you very honestly, up until recently, I haven't had the courage to even consider a street retreat. And I'm trying to get up the courage to have a street retreat. So maybe you guys can help me along in that, right? You send me your good juju. So a street retreat is when we as the people who choose to go, we step into the homeless community 100% as a homeless person. Okay, and we have a person, his name is Joshin, and he comes with, but we step into a community for 72 hours, actually I think it's 4 days, it's 4 days of living that experience. And we don't get help, and we do exactly, and we live exactly in the way that the homeless people do. And that is fully bearing witness to that, right? So how do we really know what the homeless person experiences or does or needs until we step fully into that experience? Now that's a deep, extreme example of bearing witness, right? And so we don't need to be involved in a school shooting to bear witness. We don't need those experiences, but what we do need to do is step forward not knowing and coming to saying, I want to bear witness with you and be fully in this experience with you. And from those two tenets of bearing witness and not knowing, we can come from a place of compassionate action. And that is the last sort of third, the third of these tenets, is I can step into compassionate action when I truly have made myself a witness to your suffering or your experience and come in without an agenda, right? Okay. So with that as our foundation of moving into self-care, I want to say that one of the best things that we can do for our clients is to take care of ourselves, because we hear it all the time that we can't serve from an empty cup, can we? And I think it's, the analogy of like when we get on the plane and they say, put your oxygen mask on first and then give to someone else. And unfortunately, I think for the majority of us who come from this place of lived experience and then going out and being of service and using compassionate action, we wait until we're exhausted. And then it's like, oh, I'm burned out. I think I should do a little self-care. And so it becomes this self-care roller coaster, which is really not very efficient from a physiological standpoint. So if I'm going to tap into, like, I step away from the woo-woo Buddhist, right, and I step into the exercise physiologist. And the exercise physiologist says that consistency in our care is much more effective than dropping in and saying, and this is how we see self-care show up, I think, at least my experience in social media. Girls' weekend, everybody get massages. Oh my God, spa day. That's awesome. I am totally not against a spa day or a massage or any of that, or a girls' weekend. But here's what happens. We're going along and then we start to feel it, and it's going down, and we're feeling burnt out, and we're feeling lonely, and we're feeling resourcelessness and all of this other stuff. So we go, let's rally everyone. Let's go get a massage. Let's go do this. And we get this bounce, right? And the bounce brings us up. We're like, woo, man, that pedicure felt great. Oh my God, that was awesome. Great weekend. And we start floating down again. And then we come back up. So analogous to that would be somebody who says, marathon weekend, let's go run a marathon. I haven't worked out for 6 months. Let's go. Okay. And yes, you might actually do that marathon. But how about instead, you maybe just go for a 10-minute jog every other day? Or maybe it's a walk in but the consistency over intensity. Like, why do we feel like self-care has to be this intense, powerful experience? Whew. Maybe a little bit of self-care every single day becomes much more effective. And very, much more cost-effective than the weekend away at the retreat. Or, I mean, and again, I'm not against any of that stuff. I think it's great. But I think what really gets us through every day, because some days we feel great and we go, oh man, I feel so good today, and I'm going to treat myself to dessert. Absolutely, right? But then you might think, well, I just feel so good, I don't need to take care of myself. I'm feeling great today. We wait to feel bad to feel good, right? So it's this like, we're always in this like rebound sort of rubber band thing where we're doing this. And so really, the one takeaway I would like for you to take from this is consistency over intensity. This consistent self-care, right? So every day I'm doing something. And so the 3 rituals of resilience for self-care that I'm going to share with you are very simple, and they actually have nothing to do with running a marathon, and they have nothing to do with going to get a massage. But they're very simple ways that we can drop into our experience each day and maybe elevate our effectiveness. So this is why this matters, and we've talked about some of these, but I'll go ahead and touch on them again. Anytime we take care of ourselves, it's helping us focus our mental and physical energies. And so when I have time to check in and I say, okay, like how am I feeling? What's going on with my physical body right now? How is my mental state? How is my emotional state? So one of my favorite check-ins, and I do this with my girls in the jail, I do it when I teach to the general populace, is we do the mind-body-heart check-in. Okay, so the mind, body, heart. And each one, we take a deep breath, and I usually drop into the body first, simply because it's very, most of us can really feel into the body pretty easily. With trauma, if we're going to go down that way and start talking a little bit about trauma, obviously it's a real simple invitation to inviting yourself into being in connection with the body, and because that's not comfortable for everyone, right? But when we do that, I can, and maybe just kind of for a second, bear with me here, go ahead and close your eyes for a second. And if you want to root down and get your feet on the ground, that's fine. But I want you to just take a breath and let that breath travel nose to toes. Relax your shoulders. Thank you. Where in your body do you feel something? It doesn't have to be good or bad, but just to check in. Maybe you feel that cup of coffee digesting. Maybe you feel breakfast happening. Maybe you feel tightness in your shoulders or at the base of the neck. And we're coming to this awareness of our body without judgment. We're just becoming aware, right? And then when you're ready, go ahead and open your eyes again. So maybe, what did you discover? And I'm not going to ask for you to say it out loud, but maybe just a simple, this is your body check-in. Oh gosh. Man, I got like a tight hip I didn't realize I had going on. That's why I'm leaning to the left when I sit here, right? Oh, I feel this right in the base of my neck. Or, oh, I could really hear my tummy grumbling, right? So just checking in with the body, right? So a body check-in. And then we do the same thing with the mind. And what I like to imagine when we check in with the mind is that the mind is like a snow globe. And you guys are going to feel the snow globe today really hard. Because every time one of us gets up here to speak, we take the snow globe and we go, right? And it's all good stuff too, right? It's like, oh my God, I'm going to do that. No. And that's a great idea. And I love what he said. And I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to take that quote. And I know what scallions are. I got the answer. Like, yes, I know what a bonnet is. I got the answer, right? And when we just let the snow globe settle, so then we take that breath up into the mind, and in our mind we just imagine all those thoughts being the snow, and it just settles, and we see what's there. Gosh, I'm really thinking about what David said. Both the Davids, right? They had amazing things to say. Gosh, I'm really leaning into that thought about how I could be better in bereavement, right? And let those thoughts just settle. Because that's when your awareness comes around. And I'm not judging it, right? Or maybe my thoughts are, I got to catch my plane and I got to do this and oh, whoa, I'm not even in the same room right now. I checked in and it turns out I've checked out, right? Because that happens a lot too, is we check in and we found out we checked out. And so that's how we become aware of what's happening. And then we can better bear witness, right? So if I know I've checked out, then when I'm sitting with somebody, I can check in. Because I've noticed that about myself, and I know that. Right? And then it's checking in with the heart space, and that's a really difficult. So I don't recommend you guys doing, a check-in with your trauma people, right? So your people you're working directly with. Really difficult. I do it in the jail. Sometimes it kind of depends on the energy I'm getting from the girls. So sometimes I say, put your hands over your heart, take a deep breath, and I say, in that breath, breathe into the heart where all the emotions live, and shine that breath into the dark spaces and open it up and let that light live there for a second. And I say, without judgment, just simply awareness. What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you experiencing? There's usually some tears. Yeah, sometimes there's some tears. But for us, as we, come into the space that we need to be in, and as we're not knowing and bearing witness, we can be like, wow, I have a real sadness today in my heart. Or I can be like, whoa, man, I have all this joy. I'm in this really great conference and things are going awesome. Or maybe with all of it, you're just kind of feeling into that space. So bringing our mental and physical energies into focus, I think that's one of the things. And so part of having a self-care routine, can you simply give yourself the gift of just a simple check-in? Again, we're going for consistency. We're not going for intensity, right? And so a couple of these other ones, I think a lot of them are sort of self-explanatory, but I'll just touch on them really briefly. It is prevention instead of reaction, and that's what I'm talking about, right? So we're not just reacting to being burnt out, but we're actually preventing the burnout from happening. And when we're focusing and bringing that attention to self, not only are we sort of preventing the burnout, but we're noticing how it might come up for us. Okay, so some of us have a real physical, a somatic sensation of burnout. The body gets tired, we get sick, right? And other of us have like an anxiety or an emotional reaction or a mental reaction to burnout. And so the more aware we become of ourselves and our body, the more we can self-regulate. Okay. It helps us increase clarity and effectiveness in our work. If I come into a meeting and I do that quick little check-in and I go, my body feels like this, my mind feels like this, my heart feels like this, and I'm stepping into a really important meeting, I'm more aware of what I'm bringing into that meeting with me, right? So maybe I come in with that angst, right? And that I had a bad morning with the kids and the kid wouldn't get out to school and, and I come into this meeting, and if I do a quick little check-in, and I go, oh, I don't think I need to bring that attitude to this meeting. I'm trying to really be effective here. I'm trying to facilitate change. Then I become aware and I become more clear in my work and I'm much more effective, right? And again, we're going for being more effective in our work, not working harder. I always say, and I have a girlfriend who is a crazy diehard Ironman triathlete. And so when we go and work out together, which doesn't happen very much anymore because I'm like, no, that looks like work. We'll get to a place where we could either go up the mountain or go around. And I go, okay, I'm going around. And she's like, no, up the mountain. And I'm like, I go, life is hard enough. I don't need to make it harder. See you at the top. And so she makes fun of me for this, right? She'll always go, you always say, life is hard enough. And I'm like, it is hard enough. I'm hardly making it through the day, right? And so we're really trying to not make work out of work, right? When we show up bearing witness and being wholehearted. So avoiding burnout. And so, David talked to this and said, how many chronic ailments are related to stress? So as an exercise physiologist, one of the classes I teach at the university in Denver is, it's called Exercise Prescription for Disease, right? So we talk about, gosh, if you get an MS diagnosis, this is what the exercise prescription should be. And we go through all the diseases. And the funny thing is, is what we talk about is one of the benefits of exercise for anything is the reduction of other chronic diseases, right? And so exercise is only efficient if we do it and if we adhere. And the only way we're going to adhere is to be consistent, right? So again, it's not about saying I'm going to work out every day for the rest of my life. It's saying, gosh, today might be a 5-minute workout. Tomorrow might be a 55-minute workout. It's consistency over intensity every single time. Increasing joy, mindfulness, and awareness. So the cool thing about mindfulness and the cool thing about self-care is that we notice the joy more intensely. Gosh, I can be present and I can look out here and see all of your faces and really touch into that place of wow, it's so cool to see you here, right? That real awareness because I'm more present and I'm more mindful of what's happening here, now. Right? And that's a good thing, right? So to raise that sense of joy. And then, of course, it allows us to be more present in our personal endeavors. How many of you would like to enjoy your families more, your friends more, your hobbies more? Right? Instead of feeling like you're getting pulled in all these directions and then you drop into family and it becomes a to-do list. It's like, okay, family, I'm home. Let's get dinner. Let's get this done. Let's get that done. Let's do this. And then bedtime at 8:30. And did you read for 20 minutes? Shit, now we have to push back bedtime by 20 minutes. I can't do that. Okay. Or you could be like, wow, here's what's happening right now, right? And just drop into that space and become more aware. Yeah. And then really enjoy. Maybe you just like have this thing where you sit with your family for a couple minutes and be like, so what's up, family? Like in my house, we do high-low every day. So high-low is we do the best thing that happened that day and the worst thing that happened that day, right? And sometimes, like my kid will be like, I didn't really have a high. He's 10, the youngest. Why I have a 10-year-old is another story for another day, and it probably requires mental health therapy, so I'm in a good company. So the kid will be like, I don't have a high. And I'm like, well, dig a little deeper. Like, who'd you sit with at lunch? What'd you do? Because sometimes we want our highs to be really glorious, right? But maybe it's consistency. It's like, you know what? Today was another good day because I got to sit with my friends at lunch. That could be your high every day. Right? Or he'll say, I don't have a low. Everything was fine, right? It's all right. Is there something you want to make better for tomorrow? That can be the low, right? So yeah, enhancing those personal endeavors. So let's get to the meat of it, right? Let's get down into the good stuff. So I want you to think about this as creating a ritual. So consistency and ritual have a lot in common. So rituals are things that we do consistently, right? And create meaning and purpose, right? So that's what a ritual really is. And so the other thing that I really like about rituals is that rituals have a neurological or sort of an effect on the brain, if you will, that when we do something ritualistic and we do something over and over again, the mind starts to expect it, and it sends a message to the body to respond in a certain way. So a really simple example of this is maybe you have a bedtime ritual of brushing your teeth. Like brushing your teeth is not exactly what you would consider like luxurious self-care, right? It's like, yeah, brush your teeth every night before you go to bed. But if you brush your teeth every night before you go to bed, you're sending this message to the mind-body system that says, oh, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to brush my teeth, and then I'm going to change into my pajamas, and then I might read a little book or something. But the body is already thinking, time to go to bed. Like it's getting this cue, right? And so rituals create cues. So when we do this, right, whatever the ritual is for you, whatever you decide to create around your self-care, we're ritualizing self-care. And even in the word ritual, right, that becomes sacred. No, that's my self-care ritual. That's my sacred thing. You don't mess with that, right? And so there's this beauty of creating a ritual that feels sacred, and somehow that feels more important to us, doesn't it? If I just say, I'm going to go get my workout on, right? Really, it's not sacred. I can take it or leave it, right? I'm like, you go up the hill, I'm going around the hill. Yeah, okay? So I really would encourage you to ritualize a piece of your self-care, whatever that looks like for you. And I'm going to give you guys some suggestions, and then I really want you to kind of lean into what works for you, because what works for me is not what's going to work for you. And you know, I sometimes say, like, I can be a really evangelical Buddhist sometimes, really get on my like thing and like be like, this is it, let's do this way, and really evangelicalize it. And but I think the important takeaway is, how can you ritualize your self-care? How can you make it sacred? Okay, because you would say that to someone else. You would tell someone else to do that, wouldn't you? You would tell someone else to take care of themselves. So really blocking time. So I'm going to give you three things to do. And you might do them in 20-minute blocks to an hour. You might do them in 5-minute blocks to a 15-minute block. You're going to figure out what you need to do there. But what this allows us to do in our ritual is it brings us back to our inner landscape. Right? And so that inner landscape is really where the good stuff is. The inner landscape allows us to see what's happening, right? So the mind, body, heart check-in. right? We're coming back in. That self-care is allowing us to have this inner reflection of our inner landscape. Okay, so the 3 R's of our ritual for resilience and self-care is reading, writing, and reflecting or resting. And I know those seem super simple, and and if you knew that I was an exercise physiologist coming into this, you're probably hoping I would write you an exercise prescription or give you some dietary advice. Well, there's 1,001 million people out there doing that, and I think that's fantastic. But self-care is not always exercise and diet. Self-care is much more important than that, right? And again, the most important thing is consistency over intensity. So you can eat great for a day and work out for a day, but you're not going to see any change until you do it consistently. And so what I have found is a little bit of reading, a little bit of writing, and a little bit of reflecting or resting is really what our bodies need. Okay? So when I say reading, I'm not talking about 50 Shades of Grey. Or Danielle Steele or whatever it is, right? I'm saying, and there's so many wonderful books, right? Can you find a poetry book, or a spiritual book, or maybe a self-help book, but something that can make you feel like you're grounding yourself in something that is sacred to you, okay? So it can be anything that is sacred to you. And then putting pen to paper. So I really encourage you to put that pen to paper, write it out. So, this could be about your reading, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's just simply write it out. Whatever's up here comes out on paper. That loosens it up for whatever needs to happen next. And then reflecting or resting. So reflecting is coming into a meditation state. Maybe it's just 5 minutes of attending to the breath, right? Maybe it's just that simple. Or maybe in the writing and the reflecting, you find that you need to rest the body, right? So either we're going to give the body some rest, or we're going to reflect into that inner landscape again, right? So we're going to maybe, and it doesn't have to be in this order, okay? It could be any order that you want, but it could be resting, it could be, maybe you find that, resting first helps you read a little more attentively, or maybe tap into what needs to be put onto paper. Right? So it could be any order, but I really find that the reading, writing, and reflecting is really powerful in our ability to self-care. So does this feel like something you could do as a ritual every day? A little bit, right? It could just be really short. It can be bullet points. Sometimes my writing is doodling. I actually draw a picture or a flower. It's not huge, deep thoughts by Paula. It's this is what's happening today. I really have nothing, so I'm going to just doodle a flower. Sometimes the reading is just simply a really short, like a 5-sentence, or like a 3-line haiku. Something really simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. And sometimes my reflection is just to sit with my breath. One breath. There, I'm done. I checked that box, right? All right, so that's all I have. I have one last slide, but I know that I'm out of time, so if you want to take a picture of it, you're welcome to. But really just do's and don'ts. Don't make it more complicated. Keep it simple, like David said. Keep it simple. Don't put obstacles in your way. Don't be like, well, I'm going to start journaling, so now I got to go to every beautiful paper store in the town and find the perfect journal. Nope. Remove that obstacle. Go buy your 10-cent notebook at the Walgreens. Don't make this harder than it has to be. So really keep it simple, ritualize it, and make it consistent. That's it.
Thank you, Paula. It's a great gift to all of us. I'm sure we'll remember to breathe occasionally in the course of the day. And as often as possible. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Renitha Julian, is chair of the Department of Women, Children, and Family Nursing here at Rush University, the College of Nursing. She is the co-author of the Chicago Parent Program, a nationally recognized parent training program for at-risk families in low-income ethnic minority communities. She's also principal investigator of Building Bridges to Fatherhood Intervention Grant and a dynamic advocate for meaningful society change, this is important, that challenges health disparities, health inequities, and social justice. Let's welcome Renitha. Thank you. Glad you're with us.
Issues with videos today, so it should be loud enough and it should work. Okay, awesome, thank you. I always worry about that. We should be okay. Okay. Good morning still, I think. So happy to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you today. And I think I'm doing arrows. Yes. So objectives of my presentation, and we're going to talk about the role of community engagement in diverse communities, describe the process of how we went through that in terms of developing our intervention with fathers called Building Bridges to Fatherhood. And I'm also going to show some scenes from the program, and then finally going to talk a little bit about the next steps and how we're moving from really a psychosocial intervention to the really, it seems like a strange leap, but a biologically based intervention in terms of looking at the health of African American fathers. I need these. So a community engagement approach is aligned with diversity and inclusion for a number of reasons. In terms of thinking about fatherhood, that there are really this huge diversity of what fatherhood looks like depending on who you're talking to and who you're talking about. And when you think about my group of dads who are African American fathers who may not live in the household with their children, they have been sidelined to a large extent with regard to the family and the family unit, and really pushed to the margins of the family rather than remaining at the center. So I'm looking at the importance of equal partnerships in terms of engaging fathers, not just seeking input, but also thinking about shared ownership. And that, I think, is evident in the work that we've done, in that one of the authors or co-authors of the program Building Bridges to Fatherhood is also a dad who didn't live in a household with his children, but he has been involved in this work since I got involved in this work, which I think is really, really important. So the program Building Bridges to Fatherhood was developed with the Fathers Advisory Council, and this included men who are African American, who have children that they don't live with, young children between the ages of 2 to 5, and they were willing to participate in this group over the long term. So this wasn't a one-time focus group. This was literally, they were involved with us for almost 2 years. There were 12 men who were in this advisory council, the mean age 35 and a half, and their children, they had, the range of children was 1 to 9. So that 9 was pretty remarkable that one of the dads had 9 children. And not all of those children were in one household. So the complexity of fatherhood for some of the dads was really high. Our group was recruited through working with community agencies, posting flyers, just word of mouth, telling people about the work that we were doing, and asking who wants to help us engage in this partnership to develop this program to help support fathers. We had an interview guide that we used when we recruited fathers for the advisory council. We wanted to know what were their experiences of being a non-resident dad, what were their experiences with their own fathers, and why did they want to be a part of this group? Why did they want to do this? So the interview guide we thought was really very important. One of the things they told us was that they wanted to be a part of this group to help create a program where they could gain and give insight to other fathers. This is a picture of our group. I think we had one dad missing when we took our Fathers Advisory Group picture. And we met here at Rush in the College of Nursing about once a month. And so this is what our group looks like. Each of the meetings were guided by discussion questions, which myself and the other co-investigator, which was the dad I told you had been involved in the beginning. So we always guided each discussion group meeting with a series of questions, and they were sort of focused around what should the content of this program be, how long, how many sessions, where should we film, because the program is videotape based, so we show scenes that are used to stimulate the discussion. And a little bit further in my presentation, I have some scenes I'd like to share with you. The other thing that the group was involved with was selecting the name of the program. As you can imagine, that was an interesting conversation, and we had some really wild names, but we ended up with Building Bridges to Fatherhood. The gentlemen also were very helpful in helping us decide on a narrator for the program. And what the narrator is the individual who provides the factual content. So other than the video scenes, we do provide some factual information to the fathers, and our narrator was very important in doing that. So the steps in program development were, first step, trying to figure out who's going to develop the program, who's going to film the scenes, and how are we going to hire the actors or the families which served as the people who were in the program to illustrate our video scenes. So we didn't hire commercial actors. We recruited and hired true families, which is, these are families in the neighborhood, and we had this big production call, and we had families come and we interviewed them and we filmed them on camera, and we just asked them to just be a family. And so we wanted to see how that would work out. And this is the video development team, which is a company called Artistic Communications. And Mr. John Bellamy, who is the head of this organization, the picture on the right is our narrator, who ended up being our on-camera narrator, who introduced every one of the sessions. So once we got the program filmed and all of the scenes put together, we had a big premiere here in the College of Nursing. So we invited our families back, we invited our narrator back, the production company was there, and so this was the Building Bridges to Fatherhood premiere. And these families, it had, I think almost 2 years had passed, so they were much smaller than when they came back for our premiere. They were really excited to see themselves on screen and to see what we had developed. We had popcorn and cupcakes, and we really made this a big premiere. We had food, and it was a lot of fun bringing them back together and showing them the results of our work and their work as they shared with us in this process. So the final program, Building Bridges to Fatherhood, has 3 units, 3 sessions within each unit. And the first one I just want to stop and say a little bit about, and sort of how we ended up there, called Fatherhood. And what we learned from the fathers in the advisory council and some of the other fathers that I've worked with is that men have heard so many messages about fatherhood that they started doubting. Why am I important? Why? You know, my child looks like he's doing okay. Everybody says everything is fine, so it's okay if I'm not there. It's okay if, you know, my child doesn't see me every day. So it's really important that we talk to fathers about why they were important to their children, the different ways that they mattered to their children, and to help them learn about their rights with regards to being a father and being actively involved with their kids. We taught them sessions about parenting, strategies, and thinking about exposures that they may not have had with their own dads. We talked to them, a big piece was about communication and problem solving with the children, with their children's mothers. Because if they're in a relationship that may have been fractured along the way, that's really important, because mom is truly the gateway to exposure and involvement with their child if the child is living with her. So maintaining that really positive relationship, being able to communicate in a way that is calm and productive was really important. And finally, Unit 4, which we like to reserve for special populations because we don't automatically assume that this applies to every father that we're working with. So this is intentional in terms of if we're working in a criminal justice system setting, we include this component of the program, which is called Fathering from the Inside. And these are for fathers who are returning to communities, re-engaging with their children, reconnecting with their children's caregivers. And so this is an optional 4th unit of the program. The program is implemented with 2 trained group leaders who have been trained in program delivery using a manualized program. So there is a group leader manual, guidelines for group leaders, suggestions for challenges that we know that may come up along the way. There are discussion questions, role play, practice assignments that we ask dads to go home and visit with your child and practice some of these strategies out. And then handouts that we ask them to share with other caregivers who are taking care of their children. So at this point, I really want to show you some of the scenes, which I think are part of the most fun part of the program for us. We're filming the scenes and getting to see what the fathers actually see in the groups.
I'm not supposed to be touching the stove.
Okay. Well, come here.
This is tight.
Come here.
I don't know.
You want to try it? Just flip it. Can you see it? Just kind of put your... Here, hold the spatula. Just try it. And then flip it over. See?
I did it!
Julio, move that one out of the way a little bit. There you go. And flip it over again. Good job.
I did it!
Yeah, you did a fantastic job, buddy. You're awesome.
And what we find that children learn from the differences between being with mom and dad, it's not likely this child would have been in the kitchen with mom cooking. And this father just said, come on in, come on, you can do it. So the importance of that, we think, to children is really, really something that we want to reinforce to the fathers. This next scene really speaks to this intergenerational impact of children not engaging with their fathers on a consistent basis, because that hurt sometimes is really, it's lifelong.
Really? He wasn't around when I was in high school, grade school, you know, I had my first girlfriend, first kiss, you know, and I didn't have him to go back and kind of ask, you know, is this supposed to... So I suffered a little. I had to go through some processes to really understand, man. So when we finally got to this conversation, I'm like, all right, what's up?
So this father was expressing his frustration that his dad wasn't around, and he just really didn't want to repeat those same things. We also, some of the scenes engaged mothers, and this mother's perspective, I think, is pretty enlightening.
My father wasn't around, his father wasn't around, so it was like, I don't want that to be how my daughter looks at us. Oh, my daddy talks to this female, and that's supposed to be my stepmama. Or my mama talking to this man. I call him daddy too. I didn't want her to grow up looking for love because she's missing it from her dad.
So we would show that scene and we would stop and ask the fathers questions about that and ask them about that perspective of the mother. Our next scene really shows examples of fathers supporting and encouraging child development.
You gotta clean up?
Yeah.
Clean up.
Clean.
Throw them in that plate.
Clean.
Clean up. Clean up. Daddy wanna stay. You clean up. Clean up. You did that with authority.
I do it.
You do it. Just can't do this. Look.
I'll do it.
You gotta do it.
Ta-da.
Ta-da.
Okay, so then we have other examples of scenes in the program where we ask fathers to rethink perhaps what they've learned when they were growing up in communication with their own children and how perhaps others had communicated with them.
When I was a kid, my old man would tell me to do something, and I said, why? He said, because I said so. You know, there was no answer. You know, now when your kids say why, you have to explain. You should tell.
And I think that resonates with, some of us in the room. Why? Yeah, because I said so, enough conversation about that. So, and this scene is about reframing how we think about communication.
About them before you have a conversation, before you go to see them. Just say in your mind, you know what? We're not going to have any problems. It's going to be a beautiful conversation. Everything's going to be cool. I'm telling you, the only reason I'm telling you this is because I had to do it. I had to change my mentality about what I thought about my son's mother.
This next scene focuses on problem solving and visitation.
I had to go to court to get visitation and all that, you know. I guess the mom still, I don't know what it is, but the courts didn't give me really any justice, so I'm getting them every other weekend. So now she says, well, you can't get them this weekend. Why not? Because you just can't get them, whatever. So every time she wants to, he can't come over. When she's mad at me, he can't come this weekend. I have made plans and spent money, and now he can't come.
So this is, and when you think about the relationships between parents who are having difficulty, unfortunately, the person in the middle who gets caught is the child. But, it's not a good situation for either parent, but it's not helpful for the child to be in that place in the middle. So the last scene I'm going to show you is one from the 4th unit dealing with dads in the criminal justice system.
I don't think you can be a father in jail. No. You can't. You can only be a dad and sit, and try to do what you can. Because like you say, a father, you see them get up every morning, right? Watch them go to sleep, take them to school, right? Do activities with them. How could you do that behind bars? So how could you consider yourself a father?
I done been, gone from them, So I just, I can't, make up the time that I have lost with them, so I just move on, yeah.
So this was a really tough, I think, filming with these dads these actual fathers were dads who had been involved in the criminal justice system and away from their children. And so this was really a painful process for them. And how do you reconnect after you've been gone and after you've missed time that's irreplaceable? So those are some scenes of the program. From there, we went on and did a pilot study with about 5 dads, and we ran through the entire, the first 9 sessions of the program just to get feedback, to test out the questions on them, the discussion questions, and really get information to talk about, how is this going to work? Do you think these questions are good? Should we ask different questions? And so one of the things that we learned from these fathers in the pilot study was, why are we doing this work? Is this work important? And so this father felt like that the work was important, and that it was important that fathers know that they are valued in terms of the relationships with their children. They also expressed the value of fatherhood to fathers, and that fatherhood is not a chore, it's not something you play with, it's a responsibility. And in some cases, in some men that can't see their children, it's more like a privilege. So this dad expressed that he was grateful that he was a father and blessed to be able to be around his child. So our next step was to then test the program, which we just finished in a randomized trial with 183 dads against the financial literacy program. So dads were either randomized into Building Bridges to Fatherhood or into a financial literacy program. In that study, mothers are also recruited as data informants because children live with their mothers typically, or a female caregiver. We assessed fathers and mothers at baseline, post-intervention, and 6 weeks post-intervention, so at 3 data collection time points, examining father, child, and family outcomes. We're just completing preliminary data analysis, and for our preliminary data, which is just baseline data where we didn't use any of the follow-up data, we tried to look at relationships and said, what are we learning from this? And since one of the things we learned while doing the study was that only 2/3 of the mothers agreed to participate as data informants. So we were trying to understand, what is that about? Why are mothers willing or unwilling to participate in this research? And so we are currently writing a paper about predictors of mothers' participation in a fatherhood study. And what we've learned so far are that the child's age makes a difference. So moms who had older children were more likely to participate. Fathers who had more stress in their lives, mothers were likely to participate. And we had to stop and think about that one for a moment. It was like, what is going on there? And what we're thinking is that really, despite sometimes difficulties between couples, mothers were more supportive if they felt that fathers were under increased stress. So they saw the fathers being stressed and they said, okay, he's trying to be involved with this child. Okay, I'll do my part, I'll participate. The next thing we found that, and it makes total sense, that if there was less conflict between the couple, mothers were likely to participate. And then the final factor in terms of characteristics that contributed to mothers' willingness to participate as data informants was if she had a female relative that was supportive of this dad. And it took us a few minutes and some thinking, a couple meetings to say, what is going on with this? And as we did further analysis, we found that this characteristic was relevant when fathers were younger versus fathers being older. And it makes sense because when you think about that grandmother influence or that maternal influence of a female, the mom's female relative, that really came into play when the fathers were younger as opposed to when the fathers were older. Bless you. So the other thing that I'm focusing on, so we've got the intervention with fathers and we're trying to support their engagement with their children, started thinking about what else could be coming into play here. What other factors might we not be thinking about sort of, immediately? And father's health came to mind. is that if a father has a bunch of issues going on with himself, might that contribute to his ability to be positively engaged with his children? So that led us to the Healthy Dad study, which is our next leg of the journey, which is really looking at the gut-brain connection and what factors might impact the brain, thinking, and subsequent behavior. So we're currently working on that study, and some of the things that are known to contribute are diet and antibiotics and stress and potential racism and discrimination. I got 1 minute, so I'm going to move on. Thank you. And we think that is important. So this study is looking at factors that we feel might influence the gut microbiome and subsequent parenting in fathers. And the factors that we are looking at are father's age, his weight, height, sleep habit, which is circadian chronotype, his dietary intake, lifestyle behaviors, racial stress, and resilience. Because there were so many negative components in terms of looking at this that we felt like resilience, which is the flip side of all of those factors, also could have an impact in this work. So we're looking at that now. A big issue was countering challenges to this work, which is microbiome research involves collecting stool samples. So with all that you hear about the reluctance of some men to seek health care, you said, oh, okay, then you're going to complicate this by wanting to collect a stool specimen. And so we did some interviews with men, and we said, okay, what works? And again, it's about the engagement and going to the people you're working with to really learn what's going on. So traditional specimen collection of a stool specimen, not pretty, very involved. And you need to put it in your freezer before you return it. So I'm like, that's not sounding good to me. So I can imagine how that sounds for the dads that we're working with. So how we got around that is we have a different process, which you still have to collect the specimen, but this is a very tiny little package in a little tiny little tube. You put the specimen in there, you shake it up. It doesn't have to be refrigerated, frozen, or anything special, and you return it to me in a little brown envelope. So that seemed to resonate more with our dads. It's like, okay, I can manage that. And so we're doing well. We're about halfway done with data collection on that study. So I think we've sort of hurdled that barrier to participation. And so we're moving forward with this research. And I look forward to really what we learn about that as we look, to focusing on the health of dads as a factor that also influences their involvement with their children. So I don't know if I have any time left for questions, but there I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Renita. We do have about 12 minutes or so before the noon hour and the beginning of our lunch. And in these 12 minutes, we can take questions and receive your comments on any of this morning's speakers. So if you have something you'd like to say, please just raise your hand, give us an indicator, and we'll hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I'll go back this way.
Hey, John, just a reminder, if there's any questions for the live stream, if we could repeat the question
You bet.
into the microphone.
I will. Okay, to get us started, I'm going to see if I can pull a couple of quotes from some of our morning speakers. This is from one of the cartoons. There's no problem so bad that you can't add some guilt to it and
Make it worse.
make it even worse. Right. We'll try to avoid that one. Sometimes you have to start the dance. Sometimes you can only take a step. And sometimes
You have to listen to the
just listen to the music with the kids. Right, absolutely. And another from David's presentation, the mantra that he had to repeat 4 times. We all want to try to make things better. It's an impulse as a leader or administrator. But no matter what you do,
It's not going to be okay.
it's not going to be okay. All right. Wow, okay. Now your thoughts, questions, a note, something you'd like us to underscore in our thoughts.
I wanted to ask, when you interviewed the fathers, where they lived or the communities they lived in, was that an important factor of why they were chosen for the study? Outside of the fact that they were African American fathers, did you pick them from certain segments of the city, or how did you make that?
Okay, I'm going to repeat your question
Sure.
from up here so
Okay.
others can hear it. In the selection of fathers that participated in the studies, were they chosen it because they lived within the communities where the studies were taking place?
Correct.
And if you can respond, perhaps you can come here.
Is my mic still?
Oh, your mic's still live.
My mic's still live? Okay.
Oh, good.
All right. We actually went anywhere and everywhere. Wherever we thought we could find an African American father, we went. So we were not limited by community boundaries. And what was interesting is we had one father, we were having groups on this side of town, and he lived 200 south, furthest component of the city you could possibly live. So we learned some things about staging when we moved from side to side with the groups, because we ran groups on the west side and groups on the south side. But we literally recruited from, we had no limitations there.
That's good.
Yes.
I thought it was genius that you guys did film one of those vignettes in the barbershop. And was that intentional to choose places where men were more comfortable speaking?
Yes. That was, I think, the most intentional piece of what we did was the barbershop. And the question was, I will repeat the question, was filming in the barbershop intentional with regard to being a place where fathers are comfortable and where men congregate? And absolutely, it was a central point of what we did. And we had the most fun in the barbershop.
I have one more question for you. How did you make the link between the maternal relative of the mother being important in influencing the mom and being willing to participate in your study regarding fathers?
So the question was, how did we make that link about the mother's maternal relative being influential in the mother's willingness to participate in the study? It was one of the things, one of the research measures that we collected data about was social support. And so we collected data about who is helpful for you, who is supportive of you being a father, female relatives, male relatives, friends, and that was the only one that really rose to significance, whether or not the mother's female relative was supportive. Okay, thanks.
Can you talk a little bit about the length of the videos that you watched and the process of kind of unpacking that?
The question was, could I speak a little bit about the length of the video scenes and the process of talking about them or discussing them, or?
What the fathers did next, was there some homework after that?
Yes.
The whole process.
Yes, what the fathers did next, what the process was, and all of that. Well, each of the video scenes were fairly brief, long enough to give fathers something to think about. And then the group leaders started digging, so to speak, and facilitating discussion around that scene by asking questions of, what did you see this father do well in this scene? What would you have liked to see this father do differently? Has anything like that ever happened to you or to anyone that you know? So those were the types of questions. And usually fathers said, yeah, you know, I know this happened to me or this happened to my friend. But we also gave practice assignments. We also, when we had the chance to do role play, of new skills and strategies. We thought that that was really important, and said, you know, how about you be your child's mom and you play yourself, and let's have a conversation about visitation, or let's have a conversation about picking your child up, or an interaction with another father, for example. But they always had practice assignments, and we call them practice assignments rather than homework. We thought homework might have a negative connotation, but we call them practice assignments, and then they would come back and talk about how that went the following week.
Yes, please.
One more question. How did you get the buy-in? What was the reward, and what was the enforcement you did to get them in to participate in this study? Did I miss that, or did you tell us that?
I did not. The question was, what were our recruitment engagement strategies in getting dads to participate in the study? They were incentivized for data collection. They also had dinner, and we also gave an incentive for attendance. So that was something we learned along the way, that, you know, we had to overcome the other barriers or challenges they might have had to go through to come to the group. So we had to make it worthwhile. And so, you know, this is something to think about when the study is implemented within the context of a NIH-funded trial versus the real world and broader dissemination. It'll be interesting how we continue to maintain that process. And we're thinking about other things that might influence their involvement to try to see if we can overcome additional barriers, but those were the incentives that we offered. Thank you.
Question for David. I'm curious about how you prepare yourself, your team, how you self-care with the types of events you're exposed to.
So the question was about professional self-care for myself and my colleagues. So first part of the answer is I have colleagues, and that is part of the professional self-care. So the people who are on the professional advisory board are people that I selected, not only because of their expertise, but because I thought they cared and could work with them and wanted to work with them for decades. And so that is part of it, is we provide some support to each other unofficially. We try and go in teams. Our center actually does not have that much in the way of staff. There's only one paid faculty member, that's me, and one paid staff person. And then we just have parts of 2 other people that combined are only a quarter FTE. So we don't always have the capacity to send large numbers of people together, because we don't charge for our service, and therefore we don't generate revenue, so it gets hard then to hire a lot of people. I think the other thing is individually, I think we each need to self-reflect on the impact it has on us and make sure that we do consciously do professional self-care. So for myself, when I was working in New York City, it was a bit overwhelming. I spent about 40% of my time commuting into New York, which required staying overnight. So it was a lot of time away from my family and from my home. So what I did was scheduled around my kids' concerts and their school commitments and stuff, so that I didn't miss anything that I thought was important, and the school system was willing to schedule 55 days around my schedule. And then the other thing I did was, when it was getting particularly intense, because I was not only just doing the trainings, I was also working with a lot of other projects, I actually just went and got half-price theater tickets and went to musical comedies. And that's actually what I found is a good distraction. So that's why I wasn't at the event last night, because I was seeing a new musical. It's going to Broadway, and I booked the ticket before I knew about the event and decided that I need to schedule some time for myself. So that's part of what I do. So, and then I think you have to just always be conscious of what impact it's having, thinking how you're feeling at the time and why you're feeling that way. So if I find myself getting frustrated or short-tempered or impatient, even if it's at a restaurant or something, I do reflect on why that is occurring and what that means for me, and what I then need to do to make sure that I kind of remedy that to some degree.
I got
Yes.
And it's for you. And it's related to, I don't know if you have any experience working with communities that experience chronic trauma, such as many communities here in Chicago, compared to single tragic events such as the ones that you have been working with, and if the interventions would be pretty much along the same lines or not.
Okay, so the question was about situations of chronic trauma, and I'd also add what I call cumulative loss. And so I have been to communities, including this one, including Chicago, where I've raised that issue because I was in one school. I'm not going to identify which community because just out of privacy issues, but I was talking about the fact that kids actually don't get used to this, and that when there is chronic loss, it's actually cumulative, and in my opinion, it's multiplicative or exponential. It's not just additive. Individuals who have achieved post-traumatic growth may be in a better position to deal with future adversity, but when there's large amounts of loss and trauma, they don't achieve post-traumatic growth, they just remain traumatized and grieving. And they don't have the ability to process all of them. And I was going through that presentation, and somebody in the audience said, well, you don't understand our community. It's actually normal here for children to be in gangs. And then he said, it is normal here for children to murder other children. And I just said, I'm sorry, I'm not from this community, but it is never normal for children to murder children. And as soon as you say that, it implies we don't have to do something about it, and I will never be okay with that. And that these kids actually are deeply affected by these events. And what we believe is that they may actually place themselves more in danger because of their sense of vulnerability. There's this comment that these adolescents feel they're immortal, and I'm like, no, adolescents recognize their mortality. It is deeply concerning to them. If they don't feel the adults are going to be able to protect them, they may turn to peers for that, or they may actually place themselves in positions of danger, whether that's through drug use or joining gangs or being in violent situations or carrying a gun, because either they believe it protects them or they want to challenge that risk and convince themselves that they will survive. And that counterphobic behavior and reactive risk-taking perpetuates a lot of the problem and adds to it. And so it got to the point where when I said this in that session at the school, the person kept arguing with me that I didn't understand, and I actually had to take a break in the session because we couldn't continue. He did come up to me quickly in the break and said, I want to apologize. I shouldn't be saying it's normal for kids to murder kids. We need to do something about it, and I want to start the session back up. Would you please do that? So I do find that and even in the situation, I believe I can share this because it actually was said in a public meeting, but when we were working with Broward County Schools after the shooting that happened in Parkland, that was one of the issues that I raised. That's one of the largest school districts in the country. It's a large geographic area, and it includes some communities that do have high rates of violence and loss. And we don't want to suggest that, I was on some panel, and I made the point, and one of the students from Parkland was there, and I said, people keep telling me that we should be shocked that this happens in communities such as this, whether it's the affluent community of Parkland and Coral Springs or Newtown. And I said, but we should not stop being shocked when it happens anywhere where our children live. And that any solution we come up with has to resonate not just with those of wealth or higher socioeconomic groups or in communities that are generally safe, but it has to be relevant to all of those communities. So when we're working with the Broward County school system, we're talking not just about preventing it in Parkland, but preventing it even in communities where they've had other violent episodes. And one of the things I find so remarkable from these kids who have spoken up is that they are not just trying to protect themselves and those like them, they are trying to protect all children. And if you went for the March for Our Lives, the majority of the presenters were from communities that are more characterized by chronic loss and violence. And they were not only given equal footing, they were actually showcased. And I think that that's unusual for victims of a tragic event to think beyond themselves and those like them and to think more broadly. But yes, so it's a very important point, and we go in and I articulate that. Because if you were sitting there, if your child died by gunfire in a gang, it is no less a loss to you than if it happened because of a terrorist attack or a mass shooting. And we have to, usually what I say is that when you lose someone you care deeply about, the loss is infinite, and 5 times infinity is still infinity. And you get to a certain point where it's just a horrible tragedy. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time because I know you want to get to lunch, but I think that's an important point, that we not just think about the events that have happened in certain places, but the events that happen everywhere.
Thank you, David. Thank you to all of our speakers this morning. The lunch period is beginning. There are boxes back there, and if you ordered a vegetarian or gluten-free